This is from Christine Demmer, who says, I'm here because it's actually very difficult to find out facts about the effects of Brexit on our daily life. I'm, for example, suspicious that some of our cost of living increases may be at least partially a result of Brexit. Am I right? If yes, to what extent?
Thank you. I can answer that question quite briefly to say, yes, they are attributable to Brexit, not entirely. My economist colleagues are trying to disaggregate exactly how much is attributable to Brexit. But as you've seen, all of that paperwork I described at the beginning, all of that has extra costs. The extra staffing that's been required by hauliers and individual companies, that comes at a cost. So yes, absolutely. We know that. What we do know, all of the predictions, actually, even before the referendum, have broadly been borne out that there will be a hit to GDP of about 4 to 5%. Now that doesn't mean too much in terms of what you're paying for your loaf of bread or your pint of milk, but some of it is absolutely attributable to Brexit. And the other thing to note as well is we're going to be getting less choice of foods and other goods because, of course, EU companies will say that the UK market is not worth bothering with, even though we are repeatedly told that we're the 6th largest economy in the world. It's only a market of 60 odd million. And if you've got to do battle with all of this bureaucracy, it's easier just to service the rest of the EU 27 rather than add in the complication of the UK. So there will eventually be less choice.
We have a question from Sarah Molliver. You referred to problems in the supply chain, particularly on the M20 into Dover. She asks, are there more problems with supplies in different areas of the UK?
Yes, we're not hearing reports about that so badly, but as Dominic Raab discovered, the main arterial route into Europe and from Europe is indeed via Dover. And it's not surprising because there is a very narrow crossing. Now, again, the UK would say one of the reasons for the problem is that there is a spike after Christmas where businesses are restocking, and 1 or 2 of the ferries are out of action at the moment, and that helps explain the problems. But bottom line is it's also to do with the paperwork, and it's also worth bearing in mind that if it's true that the French are asking for wet signatures, it's just a good example of what the French can do to make life more difficult for importers if they decide that they want to start doing a bit of gentle retaliation over what's going on in respect to the Northern Ireland Protocol.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to slip in now a question that we've thought about in advance, because as I said earlier, we really want to understand the EU better and the relationship between the EU itself and its member states. And this question is about the supremacy of EU law. I'll quote Suella Braverman at you. She says, we see an ever closer union with ever-growing powers to pass EU legislation which member states have no choice but to accept. We see a court that reigns supreme over all member states' courts in an increasing number of areas. It was Brussels and not Westminster that was sovereign. Under the European Communities Act 1972, the British people, through its parliament, could not say no to new EU rules. Now, you may not agree with all of that, and most people would not agree with everything that Suella Braverman says. But can you please briefly tell us about the supremacy of EU law and how it affects the sovereignty of EU member states?
So thank you for that. So I'm afraid Suella Braverman, who I did in fact lecture but not teach, and clearly didn't teach very well because she has not understood, is incorrect in almost every aspect of what she says, or at least is extremely partial in what she says. Point one is that any EU legislation adopted has to go through the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament, and all member states are represented in those two bodies. And the larger the state, and we were amongst the top three largest, the greater the say, both legally and practically. And in some key areas like taxation, social security, any member state had a veto. So this argument that we couldn't block anything is incorrect. Other areas, it's true, it was qualified majority voting, so states could be outvoted. But in fact, nearly all discussions used to go to the point where member states could more or less agree. It very rarely ever went to a full vote. So she's incorrect on that. As far as the ECJ is concerned, of course, we had a British judge at the ECJ, we had a British judge on the General Court, and we also had a permanent Advocate General. And so, in fact, this idea that this foreign court was imposing rules on us over which we had no influence is fundamentally untrue. And indeed, most people, I think, from both the UK and outside the UK said actually UK judges had a disproportionate influence, and indeed UK advocates had a disproportionate influence before the Court of Justice, because they're used to arguing in court, and the British adversarial mode was much appreciated there, with high quality advocates who were able to make a compelling case. And so I think it's incorrect what she says. Of course, there is always a grain of truth that if you join a golf club, the fact is that you've got to sign up to the rules of membership, and sometimes they're rules that you don't like very much. Now you can work to change them, but the fact is the bigger prize was to actually belong to the club and play the golf and get the benefits of membership. And I think that misses the point. Specifically on supremacy of EU law, absolutely. EU law takes precedence over all conflicting national law. And yes, absolutely, the European Communities Act 1972, with a lack of clarity, it must be said, essentially gave the green light for that to apply in the UK. But for some people, they say, gosh, this is really shocking, supremacy of EU law. Others would say, it's essentially a conflicts of law rule. In other words, you've got two legal systems operating together, and sometimes they collide. And when they collide, one has got to win. And you've got to work out which rule is going to win. And EU law says, well, we are going to win, as it is the case in any federal or quasi-federal system. My final point, in answer to the questions you were raised, you say you would like to inform yourselves, which is terrific, in the hope that we will rejoin. I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but I think it's extremely unlikely that we will rejoin as a full member in my lifetime. What I think is more realistic, and this is what I think we do need to be thinking about, and I think the EU needs to be thinking about, is there an arrangement that would be more acceptable for both the EU and the UK and other so-called neighbour states or neighbourhood states, which doesn't require a full throttle heading in the direction of economic, monetary and political union, but takes advantage of the bits that did work well for us. And that will require a great deal of diplomacy. I should also say that there is no evidence at all that the EU want us back at the moment.
No, understood. I think I entirely understand what you're saying, and I sympathize with it personally. I think we're in the business of building options for a closer relationship. I don't think it will happen with this government. It has to happen under another government. We certainly are fervent believers in electoral reform and abolishing the first past the post system so that we get better cross-party working in the House of Commons. And it's under that kind of regime that we think such arrangements could slowly over time emerge. Can I just add one question before we go back to the ones from chat, to what we've talked about, which is the way the government refers to the UK's status now as a sovereign independent country. How would you describe the status of, say, France or Germany?
A sovereign independent country.
Right, thank you. But a member of a kind of semi-federated organization, I guess.
Yes, but in the same way as we did, they voluntarily agreed to surrender part of their sovereignty because they thought that being part of a larger group was in their national interest. None of this was forced upon them, of course, and they can, like us, they can choose to leave if they think it's no longer in their interests. The other thing I would really emphasize is there is an obsession with the EU and the question of sovereignty and supremacy. But what you don't see is any discussion about the sovereignty limitations by being a member of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and all of the other standard setting bodies that we participate in. And in fact, in the WTO, if you look at specific treaties there, like the Technical Barriers to Trade Treaty Agreement, or the SPS Agreement, Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement, these all advocate a degree of harmonization around international standards. Again, standards that we can participate in forming, but we can be outvoted on. And so it seems to be, in my view, a sort of obsession with the EU. And of course, the EU has played a much more significant role in our lives. And without recognizing the inconsistency of the narrative that we need to take back control.
Right. There have been a lot of government reports recently. The benefits of Brexit, obviously the levelling up, the Brexit Freedoms Bill, and the government is talking about having the best regulation in the world. I thought we already had. We were obviously champion gold platers, we were always told, of what came out of the EU. Are you basically saying there, Catherine, that our scope to diverge is really, on a regulatory front, relatively limited?
Yes, it is significantly limited. And I'll give you I'll very briefly just flag up why. One, because we are small. Two, because manufacturers are part of integrated supply chains, which mean that you normally have to dock to one of the three big players, US, EU, or China. And given that we are geographically so proximate to the EU, that is the logical one to dock to. Thirdly, there's something called the Brexit effect, where EU essentially sets standards almost globally for practical reasons, that they're high-level standards. Manufacturers make to high-level EU standards, that they make to high-level EU standards, therefore they satisfy the standards elsewhere in the globe. Four, the Northern Ireland Protocol. The more we diverge in England, Wales and Scotland, the more likely it is that there will be more checks at the Northern Ireland border. And fifthly, I would say Scotland has a Continuity Act which says that they are going to broadly stay in line with EU law in key areas, in particular in respect of food safety. And again, the more we diverge, the more tension it creates with the other nations of the United Kingdom.
Right. We have a question, Catherine, on the Northern Ireland Protocol about the likely impact of the situation in Northern Ireland, where this protocol seems to be coming under further attack from the DUP, while the UK government provides, the questioner says, tacit support. This is questioner Richard Young. How will the EU respond if this isn't resolved?
I must say, thank you for that. I must say, I think it's an extremely worrying time. The Northern Ireland Protocol is, in my view, the best of a very bad job. The inevitability of the consequence of the decision for the UK to leave the customs union and the single market inevitably meant that there would need to be a border on the edge of the EU, so that the EU could check what was going into their single market. And there are two places to have that border: north-south, i.e. between Northern Ireland and the Republic, along the 300-mile border on the edge of Northern Ireland, or east-west, i.e. essentially down the Irish Sea. There are only two places to have that border. The north-south is ruled out because it's contrary to the Good Friday Agreement, which doesn't quite say, but is thought to say, that there should be no hard border between the north and the south. So inevitably there would be an east-west border. And so a border down the Irish Sea, which means goods entering Northern Ireland would need to be checked. So essentially, from that point of view, Ireland is treated as one block. Now, for the DUP, of course, this is totally unacceptable because it effectively carves out part of the United Kingdom and dumps it in the EU. And what is absolutely astonishing to me is why the DUP ever voted for Brexit, because this was inevitably going to be the consequence of us leaving the EU. There is no evidence at all that this had been thought through by the DUP, and we are now in the mess that we were inevitably going to be in once a decision was taken that we would go for a very hard Brexit. Why am I so worried? Well, if you look at the different parts of the moving parts at the moment, you've got the DUP facing elections in May. The DUP's support is declining. Sinn Féin looks like they're going to be the majority party in the Northern Ireland Assembly. So the DUP have got to show that they're standing up for the interests of the Protestant community, and also showing that they are doing something about the problem. You've got Liz Truss supporting the DUP, saying, wrapping herself up in the unionist flag and saying we are a unionist party, and also being able to use this to say, look, we told you so that the Northern Ireland Protocol isn't working. And of course, remember too that Liz Truss has got her eye very firmly on the prize, a prize which I see maybe inching closer to her, because I see someone's just put in the chat that Dan Rosenfeld has gone as well today. So it looks like the number 10 operation is imploding from within. And so, of course, she doesn't want to upset the ERG on which she depends for becoming the next leader of the party. So all of this points to the fact that it's worth having a good standoff with the EU. Remember too, on the EU side, they've got problems because they can't be allowed to let a state blatantly break an agreement, because they're looking over their shoulder at Poland and Hungary, who are also keen to break all sorts of commitments. Bottom line is, I suspect what will happen next is that the EU will start increasing the saber rattling, and they will eventually decide to go in, and when they go in, they'll go in hard, because there's no point in going in gently, because Boris Johnson will say, puh, you know, it doesn't make a difference.
Okay. Difficult scenarios you're painting.
Peter,
All right, we
Peter,
have an entirely different question. Yes, Ian?
can I just slip in a question which I think is appropriate? Catherine, you undoubtedly will have been talking to senior government people. Have you at any time had the sense that some of them didn't quite realize what they were letting themselves in for and seem surprised, or does their enthusiasm stick with them?
The enthusiasm sticks with them. I have never heard a government minister express any sense of regret or concern about the situation that we now find ourselves in. What is slightly surprising were the articles that appeared in the Daily Telegraph in the new year saying, why haven't we made more of Brexit? we're letting the opportunity slip away. We know that Lord Frost resigned because he said the government was heading in the wrong direction and wasn't doing enough. The 106-page Brexit opportunities document that was published on Monday, in fact, when you strip it away, had very little opportunities in it. A lot of the stuff that's listed there could have been done had we been a member state.
It's full of rhetoric, and of course it's called the benefits of Brexit, and it doesn't make any mention of the costs of Brexit.
No.
Not one. Right, we have a question here from Vera Lustig, who years ago taught English in Spain, and asked what the situation is for English as a foreign language teachers wanting to work in the EU now.
Oh, that's a good question. The bottom line is they are not covered by the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And this is assuming they want to be paid. If they're volunteering, they'll be all right. But assuming they want to be paid, which doesn't seem unreasonable to me, that they are going to have a lot of problems getting themselves into any of the categories under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. That means they're dependent on domestic law. So if they want to go to Spain, they were dependent on what Spanish law says. Now, sometimes states do have programs for exchanges of that sort, but I'm afraid the truth is it's going to be a damn sight more difficult than it was before. And just on the subject of student exchanges, one of the, in my view, very sad consequences of Brexit is that we have lost all student exchange business, or students, so French school kids or Spanish school kids coming to the UK. They're not doing it anymore because most Spanish and French school kids don't have a passport. We're insisting on them all having passports. They have ID cards. And there's an even bigger problem that if you've got a Ghanaian kid in your class in Spain, that Ghanaian kid needs to have a visa as well. And in the past, it used to be the case that a Ghanaian kid in a Spanish class, they'd all come into the UK on a sort of school ticket, and it didn't matter where the kids came from, the school basically kept an eye on them, and it all worked incredibly well. The great tragedy for any future is that these kids, for whom, a lot of whom, you know, had their first experience of travel abroad, and they were exposed, and they saw Big Ben, and they saw something of British life, and red buses, and it gave them some sort of sentimental attachment to the UK. That has been lost now because they're not coming here anymore because of the problems about the passport. If they're going anywhere, they're going to Ireland.
Absolutely. As one of our audience put on chat earlier this evening, as you were talking, Struth, what a nightmare. Right, we have a question from Martin Price, who asks, what about an EU settled status person who needs to spend a lengthy period outside the UK for, say, PhD research?
Yeah, if actually there the rules are reasonably generous. You can spend time abroad. If you've got settled status and you're away for 5 years, you lose that settled status, but otherwise you can come and go for quite long periods of time. So you need to just precisely check the rules, but if it's only pre-settled status, but there the rules are quite flexible.
Make sure your PhD is done in less than 5 years, it sounds like.
That's what the funders want too.
Now we have a different kind of question from Deborah Newton-Cook. It's all about family law and divorce. What has Brexit done to family law for divorced UK and EU nationals if there is a cross-border dispute over child custody? Now that may be too specialized for you, but none of our questions has been yet.
So
so it's a dispute over child custody involving UK and EU nationals and cross-border.
Yep, so there is an EU regulation on that very specific issue. We, I think, made that regulation, incorporated it into UK law, and it's still part of so-called retained EU law. but that's not reciprocated on the other side. Now, if there is a very specific legal point, it may be, obviously I don't know the questioner's context, if the issue arose prior to Brexit, there are transitional provisions which cover it. But if the question is more general, then the answer is that they're all right in respect of the EU side of the deal, but not in respect of the, they're all right in respect of the UK side of the deal, but not on the EU side of the deal. And I've just seen a question come in about mutual recognition of qualifications. In respect of qualifications that were recognised pre to Brexit, that will continue. In respect to someone who's qualified today, i.e. post-Brexit, and wants their qualifications recognised in another country, it's not covered at all by the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. It is possible in the future, it could be, but at the moment you're in exactly the same position as an Indian national wanting their qualifications recognised in France. It's one of the biggest failures of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement.
I agree. Right, we have a question from Phyllis van der Esch. Hello, Phyllis. I can't see you, but hi. And she asked, how is leaving the EU affecting our young people in terms of working in the EU?
Completely. They have lost, so simple things that they would have done in the past, getting bar work, working in ski schools, working as chalet assistants, all of that is now pretty much denied to them unless there is an agreement between the UK and that particular country. This is low-skilled work, and it's very difficult to get a work permit to do those sorts of jobs in those countries. And it's not covered by the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, because remember I said it was only those very limited areas that you can go and work in temporarily.
Okay, can I move to a question on the Constitution and quote a professor at Oxford Brookes, who wrote a piece for your UK and a Changing Europe, concluding the reason Conservative MPs hesitate and may in the end grant Johnson a stay of political execution is that they don't really know the answer to the deeper questions than law breaking in lockdown. So my question and our question to you is, from your perspective, what are these deeper questions? What are the 2 or 3 most important constitutional questions in the UK we should focus on to try and improve the nation's governance and its prospects?
I would answer first and foremost, there needs to be education, civic education, which starts from a young age, that people actually understand the difference between the courts, the government and the legislature, or putting it another way, between the parliament, the executive and the courts. And I'm afraid this government has been worse. It's not just this government, but this government in particular is very good at eliding the interests of the government with the interests of parliament and democracy. And what we're seeing, and one of the things that's very worrying about what was announced on Monday, is that it's going to be a whole lot easier to get rid of retained EU law. That's the whole body of law that's been incorporated into UK law. It's going to be a whole lot easier to do it because they're going to give themselves the power to do it by through actions of the executive, in other words, through statutory instruments. Now, all of this sounds incredibly dull, but it goes to the core of our constitution, because Parliament has almost no effective scrutiny over statutory instruments. They have much more scrutiny over acts of Parliament. But what you've seen in the recent years, partly necessitated by Brexit, is that acts of Parliament have become increasingly skeletal and have given huge powers to the government, the executive, to implement acts of Parliament through statutory instruments over which there is virtually zero scrutiny. So the alarming thing is that government, with the majority that this one has got, has used it to essentially delegate all important decisions to the executive. And so this complex role, complex interplay, subtle interplay between the role of the executive and the role of Parliament is being significantly eroded. And one of the things that's really striking is that Parliament has been packing up early over the last few weeks because it hasn't had enough to do. And yet statutory instruments are being pumped out daily without any adequate scrutiny. And so for me, that is one of the most important things. One, the understanding of the difference, that government is not the same as Parliament. And two, that Parliament should not be delegating excessive powers to the executive, which can use it in a virtually unchecked way. And thirdly, as a lawyer, I would say the attacks on the courts are I still find profoundly shocking. And the judges are not the enemies of the people. And actually, it's one of the things that generally I think we should be most proud of in our country, is that we have judges that are genuinely independent, who are trying to do the best. Of course, there are, bad apples, and of course people get it wrong, but we are not, these judges are not out to try and bring down the government.
Is this
if I may interrupt, once more relevant to that. So, Catherine, would you say a written constitution would be a good idea?
It's interesting. I'm chairing a panel on that in a couple of weeks, and I cannot make my own mind up on this. I see the arguments clearly one way and the other, because we know that a written constitution at least has the benefit of it trying to set out some of these important matters. And of course, it would make it more accessible to school kids. I remember when I was on sabbatical in the States, that a copy of the Constitution was in the classroom of every school. And so it became a document that people felt was theirs and belonged to them. So the argument in favour is absolutely. The argument against is, of course, it would take forever to try and negotiate something like that. And it may well become absolutely gridlocked. And it must be said, one of the subtleties of our constitutional arrangement is that it worked. It was flexible enough to accommodate difficult circumstances, but it did work as long as everyone essentially knew the parameters, more or less, of what they were operating under. This is what Peter Hennessy referred to rather chauvinistically as the good chap's school of government. Everyone was ultimately a good chap and knew where the outer boundaries lay. I think we might agree that this government, and particularly this Prime Minister, has been somewhat more cavalier about those boundaries. And I do think it's very striking today that what I found very offensive on Monday about the way he talked about Keir Starmer as being responsible for not prosecuting Jimmy Savile, which is totally untrue, has actually been the reason why his longest serving advisor stepped down today.
Okay, the question comes up again and again, what can we do about this? And John Spiller asks, are you able to offer any future positive outcomes about these issues? Do you have any inside information on what Labour may mean by, quote, making Brexit work, unquote, or is this just an oxymoron?
Labour's in a very difficult position because there was a huge amount of support amongst traditional Labour voters to leave the EU. Keir Starmer was a Remainer himself, and of course he's no fool, and neither are people like Yvette Cooper. They know perfectly well that what we've got at the moment is just not working. But in order to do anything about it at all, they've got to get into power, and they can't get into power if they're branded as a Remainer party. So it's really important for them to fudge everything, because the moment they're asked to really nail down what they're talking about, they are lost. But I don't think a Labour government, if there is one, would in any way start talking about taking us back into the EU, not least because the the arguments would be so bitter and so poisonous that it mean that the other things that they want to do, what the best we can hope for. And this is actually factored into the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, is to get bits and pieces of better deals when trust has been restored. At the moment, trust is at the lowest possible point. And they say, and I can see, the EU say, and I can see where they're coming from, what's the point in doing anything with the EU at the moment if they're going to renege on it at the moment? They don't like the look of it. And that's why the Northern Ireland Protocol is so important. Not only is it important for Northern Ireland, but it also is a bellwether for the attitude of the UK government to compliance with its international obligations.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to stop asking questions right now. And I think this is a moment, Ian, when you might open the floor to one or two people. I see, for instance, Roberto Franceschini, who has both a symbolic hand and a real hand up. And if you were able to unmute him or enable him to unmute himself, he would tell you what he has on his mind. Roberto Franceschini.
Perfectly appropriate. I think Roberto is about to speak, which is good.
Thank you very much for that. I'm minded to ask Catherine, I'm from the Devon branch of the European Movement, exactly what would happen if the British government insisted on issuing only temporary visas for short periods. I was in Italy in the 1960s. The Swiss adopted a similar policy. Year after year, workers from the south of Italy would go into Switzerland on a visa for 12 months, 11 months, actually in a few days, and have to return home and come back the next year to do exactly the same job. And what it actually meant was that they could not get residence in Switzerland. However, in a particular period, in the early 1970s, the European Commission insisted that if anybody was to work in Switzerland, they would have to go there without having these restrictions. Is there a similar arrangement that could be imposed on the British by the European Commission if they start being as dogged as they are, the British, with temporary workers?
Thank you for that, Roberto. No, I think the answer to that is absolutely not, because now, of course, we're no longer part of the EU, so the Commission is in no position to give us those sorts of instructions. Secondly, we know that the government plans, it says the only reason why they're offering temporary visas at the moment is to deal with these, what they call sort of transitional problems, that ultimately British workers will do these jobs, or at least machines will do them instead. And indeed, they're reducing the number of visas which they will offer as the years go by. I think they go down next year and they go down the year after. And the other thing I would say is, of course, the UK government does not want to give these people the right of residence, which is why these visas are temporary. In fact, what we are seeing now is it's not very attractive for EU nationals to come in on those visas, because other countries are experiencing difficulties as well. And if you're Hungarian or Czech, it's much better for you to go to Germany, because you don't have to go through any of these problems, because you would take advantage of free movement. And so what we're seeing is the people who are coming are primarily Ukrainian and Moldovans. So they're sort of Europe neighbours, but they're not EU member states.
Thank you very much for that.
Ian, there's a hand up from Deborah Newton-Cook.
Yes, thank you for that. Let me ask you to unmute. I think that makes it work. Right.
Yep.
Is that working?
Yes.
Great. That's been a very interesting presentation of a wide-ranging selection of difficulties that we're currently embroiled in. You won't know, because you can't hear the difference, but I'm actually calling in tonight from Brussels. so I get a slightly different perspective on some of these things. What I wanted to go back to was something that you mentioned almost right at the beginning, which was the reintroduction of wet signatures. Now, I know this is a bit geeky, but the reason I read that the reason that this has been the case is that the EU had offered the UK the possibility to continue to stay in effect, the EU's electronic signature mechanism, and the government said no, thank you. We'll go and write our own. Well, if you bear in mind the length of time that the government is taking to make its CDS replacement for the chief customs software to work, it's years behind, and it's still not due till 2023. I wondered what you thought about any chance of the UK government this side of a general election changing its mind on wet signatures.
Yeah, thank you for that helpful question. Yes, I'd also read the same, that that the UK had refused to participate even in the EU's electronic signature mechanism, because remember, their touchstone in all the negotiations was, of course, sovereignty, and anything that in any way looked like it was occurring in making inroads into their sovereignty, they wouldn't touch, even in areas where it really did not make any sense at all for us to go it alone, of which EASA, being a member of the Air Safety Agency, was the obvious example. And so I think at the moment with this government, there is virtually zero chance of any shift, because any attempt at shifting will meet the wrath of the ERG, even over something as techie as electronic signatures. And so they, and it will take at least a different prime minister and probably a different government before anything shifts.
But what about, sorry to have a second bite of the cherry, but what about when other aspects of the EU GB customs import declarations come into effect this year? The Kent traffic queues could very likely be reproduced elsewhere around the country, which will be tailbacking into Conservative constituencies, and there will also be, considerably less produce on the shelves, because another point I made in the chat, and I'll just quickly chuck this in, is that a lot of the queues currently consist of empty lorries. These are EU lorry drivers going back empty. And as you quite rightly said, these people are being paid by the kilometre, not by the hour. So, you've done a couple of those, and some of those are not just hours, they're days. I can't see these people coming back, 3, 4, 5 times for the same bit of non-fun without any facilities along the A20 or whatever other road they end up being queued on. So I think this has potential to escalate perhaps before the next election. But anyway, I'll keep my fingers crossed on that one. And I'll shut up.
Thank you for that. I think I would say that the problem is particularly acute in Dover, because there is just zero space around Dover because of the geography, with the town on one side, the wonderful the castle, and the town and the sea, and it's just very cramped indeed. But unfortunately, or obviously, that it's always been the biggest access arterial route in and out of the UK, and the government was warned this, but this goes back to lack of planning. The fact that Dominic Raab thought it was acceptable to say, I hadn't realised that this was the principal way that goods came. I mean, it doesn't take much of a grasp of geography to appreciate that.
Thank you, Catherine. I don't see any other hands up. So as we're kind of almost at 9 o'clock, I'm going to thank you very much indeed, personally, and hand you back to Ian, who will sum up and thank you on behalf of North East Surrey for Europe.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And yes, it is time. And obviously, thank you to Catherine. Certainly it's interesting, but I'm not going to gush. It's not very encouraging for people like us. In fact, I might almost criticize you. You could have brought a little bit of good news to slip in to cheer us up, perhaps. But anyway, it's very good to hear from somebody reliable, quite frankly, like you, because there are a lot of not very reliable people. So thank you very deeply from North East Surrey for Europe and from all of us. And to anybody who wants to stay on and chat a bit, we're going to keep the meeting open at least. So thank you to you, Catherine.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your kind words. I would like to be more upbeat, but I'm afraid I think we are in a very bad place at the moment. And whether you're a Leaver or a Remainer, and obviously this audience is predominantly Remainers, but who are of course on the losing side and so particularly disappointed. But even from a Leaver's point of view, I think this is not a very satisfactory place to be in. And so all we can do is hope that we will eventually get a government that recognises that we have more in common with the EU than against, and that having a closer relationship is in the interests of us all.